incredibly self-indulgent, self-aggrandizing, all about themselves.
To argue why they should have free speech but also be condemned, that's quite a difficult political argument. It takes some guts because it means that you have to be up for the political battle, and we know that Labour government is never up for that.
They know that he's weak. They know that he has U-turned on so many policies so far. Welfarism is like the ideology of the Labour Party.
Beneath the gloss of this kind of like lovely, liberal, progressive is some really, dark views, but also some kind of classic crap woke.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined as ever by Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
We've got loads to talk about today. We'll be discussing Palestine Action, the rise of Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer's woes, and a big upset in the New York mayoral race. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to this channel and click the bell. We're nearly on 150,000 subscribers, so you could be that special person making it happen for us. And if you're just listening to the audio version, whatever your favourite platform is, make sure you give us a rating and review because it really helps people find the channel. Positive 5-star reviews only, of course. So Palestine Action, a pro-Palestine direct action group known for its quite risky criminal stunts, could be prescribed as a terrorist organisation by Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. Tom, there's no question that a lot of these stunts should be criminalised, are dangerous, are potentially many other things, potentially quite vile. But there's a bit of a danger in calling them terrorists. That seems to take things a step further.
There's more than a danger. I mean, it would be an illiberal, absurd overreaction. I mean, in terms of the stunts that have got to this point, the one that really sparked calls for the government to formally prescribe them as a terrorist group was when they broke in to that RAF base. Bryce Norton managed to spray paint on a couple of planes. And of course, anything like that should obviously be a criminal offence. It's kind of alarming that it was so easy for them to get in there in the first place. And anything that does kind of threaten national assets, national security and so on, obviously has to be taken incredibly seriously. I'm a little bit perturbed by the fact that that has totally eclipsed the stunt that they did about a month before in Stamford Hill in very Jewish North London, where they attacked a business, a landlord business, which they claimed, the business claims falsely, that they are one of the landlords for Elbit, an Israeli defence company, to the point where they were basically smashing glass and spraying red paint over a Jewish business in a very Jewish area, really horrific thing to do. But at the same time, these people, as far as I'm concerned, they're scumbags, but they're not ISIS. Yeah. And that's a quite important distinction that we should make. I mean, it's worth saying that if they were prescribed as a terror group, not only would it be illegal to be a member of this organisation, it would be illegal to profess support for them, to donate to them, potentially quite heavy sentences. This is not how you deal with an organisation like this. It allows them to play the victim, which they've been doing pretty effectively in the media and on the airwaves in recent days. And it also, I think, hands these people that kind of radical insurgent status that they really don't deserve. So I think, as ever, wherever questions of kind of state overreach are concerned, we need to make a very clear, bright line distinction between punishing people when they do break the law, obviously, condemning them when they say and do despicable things, opposing them, challenging them, but not running towards as absurd a move as prescription. It's telling how authoritarian this Labour government is that they would move to this so quickly.
Yeah, and it has flushed out all the sort of free speech hypocrites as per usual. Just like with Kneecap, as we were discussing last week, I think probably the most, for me, the most sickening sight was seeing Hamza Yusuf basically saying that, we shouldn't prescribe Palestine Action. I mean, he's right, but on free speech grounds. And this is the man that introduced the, Scotland's hate crime bill, which criminalises speech within your own home. And he's saying that it should basically be legal, apparently, to go and break into an RAF base on free speech grounds. It's got nothing to do with speech, of course.
Well, this is the thing that's, that complicates matters, is that there is, from the pro-Palestine Action side, everybody seems to be holding up their hands and saying it's just peaceful protest. Yeah. It's just as if it was just like a march on a Sunday with kids. There's nothing to see here. And of course, Brendan O'Neill wrote about this on Spike this week. There was the attack in Stamford Hill, and also Palestine Action have done things like gone into different Jewish areas and pulled down the yellow ribbons that Jewish people use to remind members of the public of the fact that the hostages exist.
Yeah.
So is that really just a disgusting thing to do? Whatever you think about the politics of the war in Israel, I mean, the fact that you would desecrate a memory of, children that have been held hostage by Hamas is just shows what kind of person you are. But, something like breaking into the RAF base or smashing up a shop, which has echoes of, as Brendan also pointed out, smashing glass in previous times in history. It is not a free speech issue. That's just a criminal behaviour issue. What is a free speech issue is, for example, Sally Rooney or Hamza Yusuf, indeed, or these people who come out in support of Palestine Action and sort of give them the gloss of a acceptable sort of vanilla right-on kind of, a bit like, climate change protesters. Like, this is the right side of history. This is something. And that's where it's really important to be able to use your free speech and be able to have them make those arguments and say, well, this is where we can defeat you. This is where, most normal people understand that smashing up Jewish shops is, I hope, most normal, sensible people understand that smashing up Jewish shops is never right. But where there is still a sort of a political battle to be had is about these groups and how they are allowed to stand for what's right and moral in this sort of Israel-Palestine debate. So there is, not only is it just a sort of a show of how authoritarian Labour is, it's also a show how lazy they are, because actually in order to not prescribe them and to argue why they should have free speech but also be condemned, that's quite a difficult political argument that we're well rehearsed at making on Spiked. But it takes some guts because it means that you have to be up for the political battle, and we know that Labour government is never up for that. Yeah,
I suspect they still want their dinner party invites, so wouldn't want to actually say anything bad about Palestine Action, but would rather just deal with it. They know they have to protect things like military assets, but they would rather not have that debate, have that confrontation out in the open.
And there's a big part of this that they were humiliated by that Bryce Norton thing, I'm sure, and that's probably a large part of the overreaction. And it's I think the extent to which these moves, and it's very similar to the kneecap thing, basically burnish their credentials as radical insurgent, allows them to pose as almost like enemies of the state and so on, is particularly irksome because it leads to this entirely kind of facile debate that you have, where you have people like Sally Rooney going, writing in the pages of The Guardian saying that people who are critical of the state of Israel are being clamped down upon. Obviously, that shouldn't happen, but that's also not what is happening here. Similarly with kneecap, with the actual crime, again, ridiculous as it is that this should ever be a police matter, you have a situation where someone is waving around the flag of a Islamo-fascist militia in the form of Hezbollah, and then people say they're just coming after people who are critical of Israel. So it kind of clouds the moral debate that we need to have, which is to make abundantly clear that these groups, they're not critical of Israel, they're hysterical about Israel, they're bigoted towards Israel. That seems to express itself with targeting Jews themselves, like whether that's actually just Jewish-owned businesses or people who are just trying to memorialise the hostages who are still languishing in Gaza. So I think it kind of distracts attention away as much as anything else from where the debate needs to be at. And also, I think, naturally corrodes free speech across the board. And I think it's why consistency is always so important in these things, because as soon as this happened, you had a lot of Palestine Action and their sort of fellow travellers, running out, as they often do, to say, well, where are all the free speech warriors now? That's why it's so important that we are there making that case, not just for tactical reasons, but for principled ones as well, of course.
It's also kind of funny to watch. It's the same with Just Stop Oil activists and, this kind of contemporary trend for going to real extremes, not even sort of like tactically sound ones, but just, lashing out, spray painting paintings or ripping stuff off, super gluing new stuff. Also the people who do that also have this really, amazing sense of sort of victimhood themselves. So when they get the sentences for like how much, but it was a phenomenal amount of money damage that's done to this.
I think it's around £30 million damage they've done. I think, even just saying that it's spray painting, well, it's done damage to the engines and stuff like that. And what kind of idiot do you have to be to think, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to be upset about getting a huge sentence? I mean, it's, I don't think they should be locked up forever. It's not throw away the key, but, you be real here. Yeah.
So there's that kind of added level of sort of narcissism and superiority is you would hope would be what turns people against them in the same way that, Just Stop Oil is very publicly popular. But I've never in my life agreed with Shami Chakrabarti, and I in some way hope to never again. But she was on the radio talking about this, and she laid it out really clearly against prescription, where she said, you know, there is a difference between things that cause harm and that, she actually talked about things that cause offence and what it means to be a terrorist organisation and threats to the state. And I think it's part of Labour's defensiveness for its track record on anti-Semitism, not just being embarrassed by the RAF attack, but, you know, the fact that it so wants to show that it's doing right by Jews now, that it does something like this, which doesn't help Jews and it doesn't help free speech.
And I guess also you see a sort of similar reaction, as you mentioned, you know, sort of Just Stop Oil people. There is this view that if you hold the correct opinion in your head while you're committing a crime, then that therefore absolves you of the crime, and that's what free speech means, which is just completely nonsense. That's not what anyone who believes in free speech has ever argued.
No, exactly. There's that self-indulgent element, and also I think the extent to which these campaigns are also ultimately self-defeating. Like, they only seem to achieve the goal of angering more people, turning more people against them, inviting some kind of criminal sanction, without ever actually achieving any of their sort of supposedly self-prescribed goals. I think is also kind of core to this, because I think a lot of this stuff is not necessarily about the Palestinians. It's about them being good people. Yeah. It's about them being, quote unquote, on the right side of history. It's for a long time, protest has sort of morphed into quite a narcissistic kind of bourgeois display of virtue. I think this is just the more deranged, hysterical extent of it. And I think it's been really interesting seeing the kind of really grim subculture around kind of pro-Palestine activism, which has grown up, which does seem to be all of the most malign trends on the left on steroids. It feels like the kind of next stage of wokeness. It feels like the kind of the new form that this form of politics, which is on the one hand incredibly self-indulgent, self-aggrandizing, all about themselves, but also has this much more hysterical, bigoted fever pitch now in a way that maybe it hadn't done previously. So it all just comes down to them at the end of the day. It doesn't matter who they piss off. It doesn't matter who they alienate. And the fact that this group seems to, at least in some part, morph out of Just Stop Oil and all the rest of it is probably telling about the kind of people it's attracting and the way in which they do business.
Definitely. So Reform UK are still top of the polls. A new YouGov MRP poll, which shows projections for seats, says that if an election were held today, Reform would get the most seats, fall short of a majority. Other polls have put Reform on 34%, which is interesting because that's the percentage the Labour government got at the 2024 general election. So, Tom, the direction of travel is abundantly clear, even if Reform is still currently falling short of a majority.
No, absolutely. And I think it's been clear for some time now that provided things carry on the tram lines that have currently been set, Reform are odds on to at least be the largest party at the next election, which, because we've seen so many polls like this, we've seen them slowly creep up since the general election that was only last summer. We've become sort of used to this, but this is an incredible once-in-a-century event that we could be looking at here. Obviously, there's a lot that could change between now and the next election. There's a hell of a lot of time between now and then. There's also the extent to which things are so volatile at the moment that, you know, parties' fortunes can rise and fall very quickly. And there's obviously a lot that, as a party, they would have to do to properly kind of fortify themselves, allow them to properly campaign, to build a genuine organisation, so on and so forth. But I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. I mean, not only are Reform chalking up these kind of historic gains, but you've got a Labour Party, a new government, which is breaking records for how unpopular it is. I mean, in that MRP poll, they would be reduced down to something like 170-something seats, which is less than half what they got at the last election. Yeah. I know we all knew that was a bit of a sandcastle majority because of how low the turnout was and because they managed to squeak it on a relatively low vote share. But everything is still to play for, you know, and I think that kind of complacency which set in after the last election, which is that things are going back to normal. Yeah. Adults in a room, pick your cliche.
Stability.
All of that. It was, you know, at the very least, it was just a kind of pause placed on the populist revolt that has been taking place for 9 years now, basically, in this country since Brexit. So, yeah, plenty to watch, but it's we shouldn't, I guess, become numb to how significant these sorts of numbers are.
Yeah. Ella.
Oh, well, it's kind of sweet that this polling has come out on the anniversary of Brexit, which was
this week,
a few days ago.
Yeah.
Because Reform was the Brexit party, but it also is the continuation of the Brexit spirit. In that, you know, obviously Nigel Farage was one of the key political figures throughout that Brexit moment, but more importantly, that the people who support Reform out in society, average voters, are people who have maintained that despite all the sort of poo-pooing from politicians about, oh, look at what it's done to the economy, oh, look at, it hasn't gone anywhere, oh, the continuous slandering of Brexit that has never stopped since the second after the result was announced. The anger about that and the desire to fulfill the promises of what Brexit could bring hasn't gone away. And, you have to admit that over the last 9 years, I've certainly had moments of severe depression where I just think it's over and gone and wasted and spent, and it's never going to happen. But I think that reform success shows that there's lots of people who aren't so downhearted about it and do want something different. I mean, Reform is a party that seems to do everything it can to thwart itself. It's constantly having these sort of almost celebrity gossip pages style internal wars.
Sacked and rehired chairman within a weekend.
And it's lots of it's high up people spend a lot of time sniping at each other on Twitter. It's, a lot of its policies are, I think, sort of semi-ill thought out. But it kind of doesn't matter because it will matter come the next election. But the thing that really matters to people is that, one, it's not Labour, and two, that it's more substantial than not just being Labour or the Conservatives, that is actually arguing, is able to, particularly its MPs in the House of Commons, are able to bring up issues that matter to people, so whether that's immigration or the rest of it. And, will in a few years' time when the election comes around, they be as, the prospects be as strong? I mean, if you look at what the Labour Party is getting up to at the moment, yes. And we might not even have to wait till the next election, because the way in which, in particular, Keir Starmer now news out that he's going to backtrack on these welfare reforms, it's not just the sort of disarray and chaos, it's the fact that it's clear that Labour has no clue what it stands for. No clue. No sort of, even within itself, no conversations amongst themselves about what they stand for. Reform knows what it stands for. And I think that's its main strength.
Yeah. And Tom, I did want to move on to talk about that. About Labour in particular. I mean, we've had 120 MPs at least threatening to block the government's welfare reforms. There's been these sort of peace talks in Downing Street today. I mean, that is an extraordinary loss. We can talk about the welfare issue later, but what an extraordinary loss of authority for Keir Starmer, who was elected with, as he would see it, this huge mandate with hundreds of seats. I mean, how can you lose a majority like that is insane.
No, absolutely. I think parliamentary parties, they can smell it as much as the country can. As far as they know that he's weak, they know that he has U-turned on so many policies so far. There's also, as you say, we could get into the ins and outs of these welfare reforms and the very kind of crude way in which they've tried to do this. Obviously, the welfare system is insane in all kinds of ways and needs to be addressed. You can't have a situation where you've got vast swathes of towns and cities across the country on disability benefits, which has ballooned over the course of just a couple of years,
and there's no relationship to people's ill health.
That is obviously something that can't be allowed to happen if you want people to live fulfilling lives with employment and meaning and so on. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that this has become the flashpoint issue, because there's often a lot of conversation about what does the Labour Party stand for under Keir Starmer or not under Keir Starmer. There's all kinds of things that this government has done to try and curry favour with the electorate, which has annoyed a lot of people. The fact that this one has really kicked off, and the way in which you see Labour MPs talking about how this is not what I got into Labour to do, I think has been interesting insofar as, even aside from the specific reforms themselves, sort of welfarism is like the ideology of the Labour Party. Like, they do kind of think of their organisation not as the political wing of organised Labour, but basically as a kind of giant NGO, quango. It's kind of a paternalistic, sort of well-to-do ladies going into the Victorian East End to, hand out food parcels and tell people how to wash themselves. It's that kind of thing which really animates them. So I think it's, and almost the whole point of politics is to make sure that people at the bottom have a few more crumbs from the table. That, I think, is the fact that it's blown up over this rather than foreign aid or anything else, I think is telling. But it is just a sign that party discipline is going to break down the situation where your leader is weak. And even with the majority that he's got, he is incredibly weak. And I don't know what you two think about this, but I've been really struck by how much people in the public really hate Keir Starmer. Like, it'd be one thing if they were indifferent to him, like they thought he was an empty suit, which he is in so many respects, but the animosity towards him, I'm not saying it hasn't been earned because he's terrible, But I can't. I struggle to put my finger on why that is. You know, it's. I mean, I know why I hate him intensely.
There's some
know,
anti-Keir Starmer graffiti outside my house that's just appeared. So, I mean, I'm not really in favour of graffiti, but I endorse that message.
There's this, there was that video that he did with this woman in her kitchen, about, go to talk to a woman in her kitchen, and she was a single mum, I think, and that kind of thing. And there was this, I don't know what the truth of it was, but there was this big conspiracy online that it was fake, that this particular kitchen had been seen various times.
It's conspiracy about everything these days.
To different people. Whatever, but the point was, it was such a drippingly dishonest video. I mean, even, it's so outdated, this whole kind of like going and pressing flesh with the common people thing. It's just like weird that he even do it anymore. And he's so dishonest. I mean, the thing about these welfare reforms is, it's the whole discussion is dishonest, because the Labour Party and anyone with any sense knows that there are lots of people who are on disability benefit who don't need to be.
Yeah.
And you can make that sound harsh by doing what Labour's done, which is just cut, and, no conversation as to why, and then you look cruel. Or you can explain it and say, huge numbers of young people claiming mental health issues is not a good thing. We should change that. That's not, these numbers don't reflect granny with one leg. They reflect a deep social problem which needs to be addressed. And you have to have some guts to make that argument. No Labour Party MP, whether it's the ones who are for the cuts, ones against the cuts, wants to have that discussion about why it is that, in particular, so many working class people find themselves on these various benefits, living, by the way, crap lives, not living the life of Riley, living really quite miserable existences. And, the flip side of it is that if you are one of those people who's faced with a rubbish job that has no prospect and will make your life miserable, or sitting at home on, a bit of pittance of disability benefit, I also don't blame them for picking the latter, because again, it's a kind of, the Labour Party seems to think it can just cut benefits and people will leap at the opportunity to go on whatever sort of rubbish job they're advertising at the job centre. That's not the case. You have to make some kind of effort to make work attractive to people, but also make the case that being unemployed is not an attractive prospect for your life. And that's not sort of to glorify work and careers, by the way. In my mind, you work to earn money to live your life, whether that's family or friends or fun or whatever it is. But, even making that argument now is like you're evil. So we have to get a little bit more honest about what is it that's actually happening here. It is not the case that we've got some kind of huge sickness epidemic in society.
Yeah, I think, what is it, nearly 40% increase in claimants since COVID. 1 in 4 related to mental health. That's not that's not sustainable. It's not a good thing. It is bad for the recipient of that, not just for the public purse or whatever, which is why, that's obviously why the cut is being made, because they're panicking about Rachel Reeves's black hole, but it's not good for the people on the receiving end of it. And so I guess it's quite sick making when these Labour MPs, okay, they're right to oppose these particular reforms, but I think they would oppose any reform. I think they would just be in favour of welfareism as
I forgot that, Tom, the point that Tom makes is so crucial about the Labour Party being like these benefactors, because they, you've got Rachel Reeves, who is desperate to make some money somewhere, but also they want to maintain this gloss of being really lovely and caring. So in the childcare sector, for example, Hackney Council, Labour-run council forever, has just upped nursery fees by like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds. It's unbelievable. And the Labour Party's main policy around children is to get people, nursery and primary school staff, to brush kids' teeth because parents can't. Yeah. And so there's this complete disconnect between what people actually want and what the Labour Party thinks people need. And it's just enraging.
Right, let's talk about a big upset in New York. Zohran Mamdani has won the Democratic primary for the mayoral race. He is a sort of leftist in the AOC type vein.
The worst kind of leftist vein.
The worst kind of left-winger, the worst kind of self-described socialist. He wants rent control, government-run grocery shops. I think it's very odd, not very exciting. But it seems to have galvanized the sort of, I guess, the American equivalent of the Corbynistas. If you look at who's voting for him, it's Like, he's did well, ironically, with the wealthiest New Yorkers, but also it's mostly this kind of downwardly mobile, perhaps, people with high levels of education, but actually quite poor prospects. Tom, what have you made of it?
Well, it's sort of millennial, quote unquote, socialism lives, isn't it? I mean, it's that very much that model where the kind of coalition that AOC, when she was elected in New York, put together, which is very similar race insofar as you have a insurgent candidate. Really did come out of nowhere. No one knew who this guy was, a few months ago, not just in the UK, but in New York City. So also pitted against a kind of old figure of the old Democratic establishment, in this case in the form of Andrew Cuomo, disgraced former New York governor, standing accused of, killing people in care homes during COVID by sending COVID patients in there, also the subject of various sexual harassment allegations. It's absolutely incredible that these were the Democratic establishment, once so powerful, if you think about New York and Tammany Hall and that history of the Democratic machine there, that they allowed these two candidates to be put before the electors. It's an expression of the kind of weakness of the Democratic establishment in many respects. But also what's telling, not unlike when AOC won her primary, is where the support is coming from. Because as you say, Mamdani's sort of coalition, such as it is, there's some quite wealthy people, the kind of luxury beliefs lot. There's also a lot of people who are still doing pretty well for themselves, but would expect to be doing better. The sort of people who haven't quite cracked through at their graphic design firm, not quite making as much money as they would have expected to, given how much was spent on their education. And are quite frustrated by that. It's not to say that they haven't got a complaint, but this isn't, the sort of urban proletariat, revolting against the establishment, shall we say.
It's not the French Revolution.
It's not. The analysis, although very early on, seems to be that he did very well with places that had above average levels of graduates and above average levels of non-Hispanic whites, which I think is a story that tells itself. Meanwhile, Cuomo did very well in the kind of like working class, outer, almost suburban areas, as well as he did particularly well amongst black voters in the Bronx. So you're kind of seeing that way in which the social base for millennial socialism, the kind of new post-Sanders, post-AOC socialism, is a mix of quite wealthy people and also people who are downwardly mobile, but from still quite an elevated position. Yeah. I think it's fair to say. So it's a repeat of that, and it's fascinating as far as what it says about the Democratic Party and so on, but I think it's also intriguing about how this supposed upsurge in leftism that we saw on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly kind of post 2016, although it had petered out for a while, A, it's not going anywhere, but B, the groups in which it speaks on behalf of are not the ones that they claim to speak on behalf of. That's always the case.
Ella?
Yeah, I think Joel Kotkin wrote Spike this week, and he called the main section of his supporters the procariat. These people who, for whom, policies like maybe not state-run grocery stores. They probably wouldn't frequent them.
Quite expensive, probably.
Yeah. But things like childcare, or there's a big thing about transport. Use a huge amount of their paycheck on getting to work, which is true. And there's nothing wrong with that policy. But it's the kind of concern of a squeezed lower middle class, I suppose we would understand it to be, or and that's important because one, those people are really politically fickle. They, infamously, they always have been, and lots were, in the bigger picture of America, lots were pro-Trump because of the sort of business grow the economy thing. But also, I was reading this article by Bernie Sanders in The Guardian, celebrating the victory, and the way in which he talked about the fact that, the old Democratic elite don't know anything, and using this very sort of big sort of jazz hands socialist kind of language, and you think, but it's just a different section of the elite. You have the kind of very sort of proper Hillary Clinton style swish networky Democrat elite, and then you have these sort of scrappy but equally kind of posh children of that sort of oligarchy, who hold the same political views, but just express them in a kind of wokier, more fashionable way. It's also, if you look at some of the things that Mamdani has said, for example, to internationalize the
globalize the intifada,
globalize the intifada, which people debate it, but in a place like New York, which is full of Jews, who a lot of them view that in a particular way, not as some kind of like, oh, let's have a discussion about Palestine, but as a sort of violent call to the death of the Jews.
Yeah.
That's something. Is he going to be speaking for those New Yorkers? And among beneath the gloss of this kind of like lovely liberal progressive is some really dark views, but also some kind of classic crap woke views around transgenderism, around all of that. And it's just very uninteresting because it's like AOC 2.0. And it just shows that the Democrats haven't learnt anything, because they're either pumping out the old elite candidates, or they're pumping out these new elite candidates, and nowhere is there anything fresh.
It's like the kind of the crap. It's just the way in which like this new left are indistinguishable from the cultural elite, essentially. And Mamdani is a good example of this. This is a guy who had a kind of an abortive rap career. I mean, like AOC, they're kind of like frustrated theatre kids to a certain extent, which is why they're so good at social media and TikTok, which is obviously a big part of his election here. I believe his mum was a very well decorated filmmaker who won things at various film festivals and so on. I think that's telling, the way in which is this thing we now call the left is basically indistinguishable from people who might be trying to get on in the various cultural industries, are finding because economically it's a bit more expensive in the cities, or because there's not as many opportunities. There's a bit of elite overproduction going on. They're working at the Whitney, but they're probably never going to make curator. That is the base of the left now. Places like New York City, and whatever else you might want to say about some of the legitimate complaints they have, that's a historic shift, isn't it?
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.